Hi everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. This week we are going to talk about the bigdei kehuna, the priestly vestments. And the reason why this is a great week to talk about the bigdei kehuna is not only because it comes up in Daf Yomi, Zevachim Yud Zayin Amud Bet to Yud Chet Amud Aleph, 17b to 18a, but also because Yom Kippur is coming up. And on Yom Kippur, the changing of the clothing of the Kohen Gadol is quite a big deal. So, having an understanding of the basic function, role, concept behind the bigdei kehuna, Kohanim wearing specific clothing in the Mikdash to begin with, will give us a really nice way to springboard into what the symbolism is of the changing of the clothing of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. So, what the Gemara in Zevachim on Yud Zayin Amud Bet offers us is at least two limudim, at least two sources for where the prohibition comes from to do the avoda, to do temple service in a state of mechusar begadim, missing the priestly vestments. And I say that there are two sources because the first two sources I think serve as archetypes, and then the third and the fourth source that are added, that are offered, I think fit into one of those archetypes specifically. Goes like this: Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Umatu ba mishmei Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. To Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "V'chagarta otam avneit Aharon uvanav, v'chavashta lahem migbaot, v'ayta lahem kehuna lechukat olam." Right? God tells Moshe, "You are going to put a special belt around them, Aaron and his sons, and you're going to put special hats on them. And this is part of a list of things that he's supposed to put on them, as we'll see shortly. And then there they will have kehuna, they will have priesthood forever. What does this teach? Bisman shebigdeihem aleihem. It is when their priestly garments, two of which were just mentioned in that pasuk, the hat and the special belt, when they have their clothing on them, then vaitalem kuna, then kuhunatam alehem, then their priesthood is on them. Ein bigdeim alehem, ein kuhunatam alehem. When they do not have them on them, their priesthood is not upon them. Now let's keep in mind, lechahen is to serve, meaning if they are not wearing these, they are not serving, right? So there's something transformative about the clothing. That is one read, that this is what transforms them into being able to do the avoda, the worship, right? It's a transformative article of clothing. It's a transformative article accessory. Then the Gemara says, but wait, v'hame hachanafka, is that where we learned that you cannot do the avoda if you are mechusar begadim, if you are missing the priestly vestments? What about mehatam nafka? Didn't we learn it from the following? Tanya, we have a braita. Minayin l'shtudia yayin she'im avad chilel. How do we know that somebody who drank wine and then did the avoda, that they have now desecrated the avoda? Talmud lomar. It comes to tell us in Vayikra Perek Yud, Vayikra 10, Yayin v'shechar al tesht v'gomer. You cannot drink wine or beer. Ulahavdil ben kodesh l'chol. You're supposed to be making a difference between the kodesh, the sanctified area, and the mundane. Namely, in the sanctified, we are not doing certain things, and in the mundane, we're allowed to do those things. Or maybe even, by the way, you need to be so lucid that you can tell the difference between Kodesh and Chol. Maybe that connection too. But this still didn't tell me anything about somebody who's not wearing the right clothing. Mechusar begadim v'shelo rachutz yadayim v'raglayim minayin. How do I know that also a person, a Kohen, who is not wearing the right clothes or who has not washed their hands and feet, how do we know that they also are not allowed to do the avoda? Talmud Lomar, as it says, chuka l'gzera shava. In the pasuk about not drinking wine and not eating meat, it says it's a chukat olam. It's going to be a forever rule, right? And also, as we just learned about the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, it's going to be kehuna lechukat olam, a binding rule. Same thing when it talks about the importance of washing the hands and feet in Shemot, Perek Lamed, Shemot, chapter 30, right? This is a very different learning of where the need for the vestments come from, rather than looking at it as a transformative article of clothing that turns you into the Kohen in a sense. Here it is. This is a prerequisite for being able to do the avoda, and it seems like it functions in a similar kind of way to not drinking and making sure that you wash your hands beforehand. And to me, that may be speaking a little bit more of a readiness factor and a little bit less of a transformation factor. So I think there's already an archetype here of, is the clothing of the Kohen Gadol something that transforms, almost like the clothing makes the person, the uniform makes the person? Or is it that the clothing of the Kohen Gadol is somehow a readiness factor that is somewhat of a hechsher, like a preparation of sorts for the avoda? Now, there are two other explanations here as well, but I think both of them are working off of the word Kohen or Kohanim and saying you are only bikihuno or bikihunam. They're only in their service when they are wearing these things. So could it go either way? Could that be a readiness issue or could that be a transformation issue? I read it more as a transformation issue. But suffice it to say, we have two archetypes. Now, in terms of where we learn about the bigdei kehuna, we learn about it from several places. One is Shemot Kafchet, which is from the Gemara that we just cited. And in Shemot Kafchet, the description is to tell Moshe what he's supposed to put on Aaron as the Kohen Gadol and what he's supposed to put on Aaron's sons as the Kohanim, as the regular Kohanim, or as we would call a Kohen Hedyot. Now, just a few things to point out. One is it's important to note that the bigdei kodesh for Aaron are called lechavod uletiferet. They are for the purpose of honor and the purpose of beauty, right? Now, is that beauty for the mikdash and honor for the mikdash? Is that beauty for Hashem, honor for Hashem? Is that beauty for the Kohen, honor for the Kohen? Doesn't tell us which. The other thing we should note is that there are different clothing for the Kohen Gadol, who wears 8 vestments, and a Kohen Hedyot, who only wears 4 vestments. And it seems that these are very important because at the end of Perek Kafchet, we have Vahayu al Aaron ve'al banav bevo'am al Or HaMoed. They should be on Aaron and his sons when they're coming to the Mishkan. O v'gishtam al hamizbeach l'sharet b'kodesh. Not only when they're in the tent of meeting, but when they're close, coming close to the altar itself. V'lo yis'u avon. They won't have punishment. V'metu, or they won't carry sin. V'metu, and die. Chukat olam lo ulizaro acharav. Again, we have the chukat olam, right? This is for him and his offspring. We also see in Shemot Kaftet a repetition about this clothing at the time when Moshe is actually putting this clothing on them. I do want to point out that this is the time of the Miluim. It's the time of the dedication or the description of what the dedication of the Mishkan is going to look like. So this is the first time these people are being dressed as the Kohanim. And as part of that, we actually have, it's almost like they themselves are korbanot, these Kohanim, because the description is V'et Aaron ubanav takriv el petach ohel moed. You have to bring close, almost lahakriv, bring close Aaron and his sons to the opening of the tent of meeting, v'rachatzta otam b'mayim, and you should wash them. V'lakachta et bagadim, and you should take the clothing, v'hilbashtat Aaron et hakutonet, and on Aaron you're going to put a special tunic, v'et me'il ha'ephod, the robe of the ephod, v'et hachoshen, and the breastplate, v'afadata lo b'cheshev, and you are going to, gird him, the cheshev ha'ephod, with the band of the ephod. V'samta ha'mitznefet al rosho, and you're going to put a special headdress on his head. V'natata et nezer ha'kodesh al mitznefet, you're going to put a special little crown kind of thing that we would call the tzitz, and you're going to put it there. And it sounds like this really is the transformation of Aaron into the Kohen Gadol. The clothing and the washing is part of the transformation. And then his sons, they have other things that they're going to be wearing. They're going to be wearing also a ketonet. They're like a tunic. They're going to be wearing a belt also. They're going to be wearing hats, a little bit of a different hat. And all of these people also wear michnasayim. They wear pants to cover their nudity. But the point is, What we know here is that this is L'chavodu L'Tifaret. We know that this is something that seems to be transformative, at least the first time the Kohanim put this on. We know that we have these two tracks from the Gemara, which seem to be, is it transforming or is it just a hechsher? Is it a readiness? Right? Certainly at the time of the Miluim, it's going to be a transformation, but maybe all the times after it'll be something else. Now, the Rambam then says that there is a positive mitzvah to make this clothing. At least that's the way he puts it in Mishnah Torah. In Sefer HaMitzvot, he puts it as there is a mitzvah to wear this clothing. That's interesting in and of itself, because when you tell me it's a mitzvah to make this clothing, what you make me think about are the kelim, the accoutrements, the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash, or the vessels of the Mishkan. And the same way I have to make a menorah, I also have to make the Kohen's clothing. Sounds to me more like these are vessels of the Mikdash themselves. Versus when you say, oh, it's a mitzvah for the Kohanim to wear these special clothing, right? Lechavod uletif'aret, for beauty, va'az ya'avdu b'mikdash, and then they're going to be able to do the work in the Mikdash. I say to myself, oh, well, maybe this is actually a readiness kind of thing. So there are lots of different tracks. There are lots of different tributaries that we could go down in trying to understand what this clothing is. So I want to offer us three different approaches to what this clothing is. And one approach comes from the Sefer HaChinuch, who explains that he says, Hayesod hakavua lanu ki hadam nif'al lefi pu'ulotav v'acharei machshavotav v'kavanotav. A person, we know people follow their deeds, right? And people are follow their thoughts, right? So meaning people are impacted by their deeds and their thoughts. V'hashaliach hamechaper, and if you have the emissary of the Jewish people who is trying to get kapara, who is trying to get atonement for people through giving korbanot, tzarich lahatpis kol machshavotav v'kavanato el ha'avodah. Right? They have to be completely focused on doing the temple worship. Al kain ra'ui l'ilbosh begadim yuchadim elaha. Therefore, it makes sense to wear specific clothing for it. Kishayistakel b'chol makom shebegufo. Anytime the Kohen looks down, miyara iyen niskar umitarer b'libo lifnei mihu oved. It'll remind him before who he is worshiping. Meaning, why are the bigdei kehuna a prerequisite for the Kohen to wear and for the Kohen Gadol to wear? Because it keeps you focused. It keeps you focused. Now, to me, that's not a transformation. That is somewhat of a hechsher. It puts you in the right mindset and it keeps you in the right mindset. So that's one approach to what this is about. Another approach goes back to the idea that these are actually accessories for the Mikdash themselves, the same way you have a special kli sharet, you have a special vessel that you catch the blood in, as we talked about last week, that you catch the blood in order to do Kabbalat Hadam after the Shechita. The same thing, you have specific clothing that match the Mikdash because they are used in the Mikdash, right? So one place you might see this is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Tet Zayin Amud Bet, says Kol HaKelim Sha'asa Moshe, all of the utensils that Moses made for the Mishkan, Mishichatan Mekadashtan, anointing them with special oil is what gave them a status of Kedusha, a status of sanctity. But Mikan ve'elach, that was the first time. But from here on in, Avodatan Mechanachtan, doing avoda with them, actually using them to catch the blood, that actually brings them to another level of Kiddusha. Now, the Tosfot in Kiddushin on Daf Nundalad Amud Aleph 54a apply this to the clothing of the Kohen. Actually, if you have clothing, the suggestion is that has not been worn yet for the avoda by a Kohen, that clothing has the status of what's called Kiddushat Bedek Habayit, the status of sanctity of things that are used for temple maintenance, meaning things that you sanctify for temple maintenance and are basically used to fix, used to fix things up in the temple, or sold and the money is used for that purpose. But that is a lower level of sanctity than, let's say, the kli sharet, a vessel, an official vessel of the temple. But once the Kohen wears it to do the avoda, it then reaches that next level of being a kli sharet. So what does that tell you about the clothing? The clothing themselves are somehow an adornment for the mikdash itself. They are part of the kelim that are meant for the avoda. And in fact, the Yerushalmi explains that miblaei mechnesei Kohen Gadol, the, the worn out pants of the Kohen Gadol, what did they use it for? Hayu madlikin et haneirot shebifnim. They would use it as wicks for the menorah, right? Miblaei michnesei Kohen Hedyot, and the michnasayim, the pants, the worn out linen pants from a regular Kohen, hayu madlikin et haneirot shebachutz. They would use it for the outer lights, meaning the torches for the Simchat Beit HaShoeva ceremony, meaning this clothing is property of the Mikdash, right? It's property of the Mikdash. It's not just here to put the Kohen in a particular mindset. It's no different from any of the other utensils in the Mikdash itself. And in fact, the Ramban, although he gets very esoteric here, so I leave it to people who are more in the Kabbalistic realms, the Ramban basically says, L'chavodu l'tifaret, to say that the clothing is for honor and beauty, says actually Yomar she'asu bigdei kodesh la'aron l'sharet behem l'chvod Hashem hashochen betocham u'letiferet uzam. He says this is, you know, kavod and tiferet are Kabbalistic terms for certain emanations of God. And it means that this is really to bring the divine emanations in some way, right? This, again, this is sort of not that these are part of the avoda, but they sort of are part of the avoda. There's something that contributes to the divine presence in the mikdash, similar to other aspects of the kelim, whether we're talking about the lechem hapanim, the showbread, or we're talking about the menorah, right? So these are adornments of the mikdash themselves. Now, I also think that sort of hiding in between here, this conversation about, is this, a readiness for the Kohen? Is this a kli of the mikdash? Is seeing the Kohen themselves as a type of korban. And when we talked about why blood is so important, one of the things we said was that there's a substitution going on between the animal and the human being. And to an extent, the Kohen is almost like a permanent korban in the Beit HaMikdash because they are mukdashim. They're really sanctified for work in the Beit HaMikdash. So I think it's interesting, or in the Mishkan, I think it's interesting that the Gemara in Zevachim on Pei Chen Amud Bet, which it'll take a while to get there, but I think it's interesting that there's a suggestion that actually the bigdei kehuna effectuate kapara. They actually gain atonement for the people. In what way? Amar Rabbi Inyone bar Sason, Lama nismecha parshat korbanot leparshat bigdei kehuna. How come the first 7 prakim of Vayikra that are about korbanot, right next to them is a chapter, a perek, that is about the bigdei kehuna, the priestly clothing. Lomar lach, to teach you, ma korbanot mechaprin, af bigdei kehuna mechaprin. Just as the korbanot themselves gain atonement, so too the clothing of the Kohen gains atonement. What do we mean? Well, let's go through the clothing. Kitonet, the tunic, mechaperet al shvichut damim. It atones for murder. Shenemar, as it says, our first collective murder in the Torah, not individual murder, but collective murder. Shenemar, as it says, vayishchatu seir izim vayitbalu et hakutonet badam. Right? And they slaughtered a goat and they dipped Yosef's kutonet, his tunic, in the blood. Now, I shouldn't say that's the first group murder. It's not the first group murder because if we think about Shechem, that's probably the first group murder with Shimon and Levi. But suffice it to say, it's an archetypical group murder. So ketonet is atoning for that. Mechnasayim mechaperet al gilui arayot. The pants, the priestly pants, which of course are to cover up their nudity, is supposed to atone for inappropriate sexual activity. Shinemar, as it says, "V'aseh lehem mechnasei bad lechasot et b'sar erva." The whole point of the mechnasei bad, the linen pants, is to cover up their nudity. Mitznefet, what about the hat? Mechaperet al gasei haruach. It actually gives kapara for those who are a bit arrogant. Minayin, how do we know that? Amar Rabbi Chanina, yavo davar shebagova. Take something that's up high, v'chaper al gova, and let it gain atonement for feeling a little bit too high. Avnate, what about the belt? Mechaper al hirhur halev. It's atoning for the wrong thoughts in the heart, okay? And Hechadite, where it is actually over the heart. The belt was actually supposed to be tied like across from the elbows, so close to the heart. Choshen mechaper al hadinim. What about the breastplate of the high priest? It atones for wrong judgments. Shnemar vasita choshen mishpat, right? That's what it's called. The mishpat, the justice choshen. Ephod. What about the ephod? Mechaper al avodah zarah. Why? Shnemar in ephod utrafim, right? If there's no ephod, there is idol worship. Okay, and then the me'il, our beautiful blue kind of robe, mechaper al lashon hara, right? It gains atonement for lashon hara. Why? Yavo davar amar Rabbi Chanina yavo davar shebakol, something that makes sounds. Because remember, there's bells on the bottom of it. V'chaper al kol hara, that should atone for the bad a bad voice, right? And then the tzitz, the golden plate on the head, mechaper al azut panim, right? It should it should give us atonement on brazenness. Betzitz ktiv, regarding the tzitz, it says, V'haya al metzach Aaron, it will be on Aaron's forehead, Uve'azut panim ktiv, and regarding brazenness, it says, Umetzach isha zona ayalach. You had a harlot's forehead, you were brazen. Right, so this explanation of how specifically the Kohen Gadol's garments are supposed to be a kapara for the people, to me says, this Kohen isn't just a functionary. This Kohen is himself a korban, right? And this to me really feels the transformative factor of the clothing. There's a whole transformation. This person becomes part and parcel of what's going on in the avodah. So we have these three tracks that again can overlap in certain ways, but basically these three tracks, one track looking at these are preparatory to help the mindset of the Kohen. To me, very similar to shtuye yayin, very similar to the technical preparations of having to wash before. Another option is that these begadim are actually part of the mikdash themselves. They're kind of they're klei sharet, right? They are vessels, and even if technically that's not the kedusha they have before the avodah happens, it is the kedusha that they have after the avodah happens. So they're similar to the shulchan and the menorah and the bazichin, right? The bowls that are used, similar to all of those things. And this third, the Kohen themselves becomes a part of avoda as a korban, as a source of kapara, or at least the Kohen Gadol, and maybe on a lower level, a lesser level, a Kohen Hedyot in their own way. Now, in the last few minutes, I want to say something about Yom Kippur and clothing, because the Kohen Gadol changes their clothes a lot on, has 5 different costumes over the course. Not that each costume is always different, because he puts back on his full Kohen Gadol garb. He has that on twice over the course of the day. But the description, when you look at Vayikra Tet Zayin, is really significant, because the description, Vayikra Tet Zayin doesn't make it clear, all the costume changes, exactly how it works. Vayikra Tet Zayin makes it look like he basically does all the korbanot chatat, all the sin offerings, wearing bigdei bad, which is linen white clothing. And then he changes, he washes, he changes, and then he changes into his bigdei kehuna gedola, his real 8 vestments. Now, I want to talk about this bigdei bad business, because it's not what a Kohen Hedyot usually wore, and it's not what the Kohen Gadol usually wore. So the Rambam explains bigdei kehuna shlosha minim. There are three types of bigdei kehuna. Bigdei Kohen hedyot, the clothing of a regular Kohen, that's four garments. Ubigdei zahav, the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, right? Which is the golden garments beyond. They all have gold within them. Ubigdei lavan, and the white garments, okay? Bigdei Kohen Gadol have four things: a ketonet, which is a tunic, mechnasayim, pants, migbaot, hats, avneit, a belt, right? Bigdei Zahav, which is the Kohen Gadol, that's Shmona Kelim. It has eight pieces, right? You have the four of the regular Kohen, plus a me'il, which is that blue, beautiful with rimonim and bells on the bottom. The ephod, which is holding, it's a very woven fabric that's going to be holding the breastplate. Then you have the choshen, the breastplate. Then you have the tzitz, the golden plate on top, right? And you should just know that the belt of the Kohen Gadol is a little different, and the hat of the Kohen Gadol is a little different from a Kohen Hedyot. But that's the usual. But on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol wears something different for at least parts of the avoda. Bigdei lavan, that's what it's called, the white garments. Heim arba'a kelim shemishamesh behen Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim. These are four garments that a Kohen Gadol wears on Yom Kippur for at least part of the avoda, and significantly the avoda that's done within the Kodesh Kodeshim. And that includes ketonet, a tunic, michnasayim, pants, avneit, a belt, umitznefet, and a special headdress. But here's what's important about them. They are linen. They are white. And these are different than what a Kohen Hedyot usually wears. And the question is, why? Why do we have the Kohen Gadol wearing white and then changing to the bigdei zahav and then changing back to white and then change to the bigdei zahav and then change back to white? What's going on here? So of course there is a Gemara that says he can't do the priestly service wearing gold in the inner sanctum because that's a reminder of the Egel HaZahav. But there are two other approaches that I think are really significant and worth thinking about. One comes from the Ramban, and the Ramban says he's dressed like an angel. He's dressed like an angel. Simple, tabula rasa. And of course, this this bad clothing, bigdei lavan, was very expensive. But there's a purity to it, right? And he's dressed like an angel for at least part of the time. But I saw something from Rabbi Yoni Grossman, and I'm giving you the link to it that I thought was magnificent. He said, it's interesting to consider that basically the same way Yom Kippur is a time for the Mikdash to get a reset, we may be reenacting the Kohen Gadol's original investment with kehuna. I mentioned earlier that when Moshe invests Aaron and his sons with kehuna in the time of the Miluim, in the time of the dedication of the Mishkan, they're supposed to wash. He washes them and he puts their clothing on them. So perhaps the washings and the movement, it's not just that he starts with bigdei lavan, it's that he moves from bigdei lavan into bigdei zahav. Essentially, over the course of the day, he starts with sort of clean slate, and then he gets dressed into his Kohen Gadol clothes. And in some ways, that is a representation of a restart, a new miluim, a new Chanukat Mikdash, a new inauguration, not only for the Mikdash, as happens on Yom Kippur, but also for the Kohanim themselves. So the drama of the clothing and also all of the washings and the immersions that he does over the course of the day, that drama is a part of the renewal of the Mikdash. My bracha to us is that this sense of renewal should be one that we experience this Yom Kippur and every year. on Yom Kippur, an opportunity to start again, an opportunity to do better, to experience better. And Bezrat Hashem, we should just be zochot and zochim to that. Gemar Chatima Tova.